If you've been using Windows 11 for a while, you've probably noticed a slow shift in how it behaves over time. Updates arrive frequently, settings get rearranged, and system features you thought were disabled sometimes reappear after major upgrades. At the same time, newer hardware demands keep rising, and background services continue running whether you want them or not. Against that backdrop, Ubuntu 26.04 LTS enters the picture with a different approach to how a modern desktop system should behave. This release is positioned as a long-term support desktop built for everyday computing, development, creative workflows, and even gaming in some cases. The bigger question in 2026 is no longer whether Linux can replace Windows in theory, but whether the trade-offs now favor making the switch for certain users. Ubuntu 26.04 LTS continues Canonical's long-term support cycle, which remains the backbone of its reputation in both enterprise environments and everyday desktop use. LTS releases are built for stability over time, offering extended security updates and system maintenance for years rather than months. This long support window is one of the main reasons organizations and individual users rely on Ubuntu when they want predictable behavior without frequent disruptive upgrades. What makes this version particularly important is the depth of its underlying system changes. It is built on a newer Gnome desktop generation combined with a significantly updated Linux kernel base. These updates are not superficial. They influence how the system handles hardware interaction, memory management, and process scheduling at a fundamental level. As a result, system responsiveness improves under load, especially when multiple applications are running simultaneously or when workloads demand sustained performance. Instead of focusing on incremental visual tweaks or isolated feature additions, this release reflects a broader modernization of the Linux desktop stack. Core components have been refined to work more cohesively, reducing inconsistencies between system-level behavior and user-facing applications. This creates a more unified experience where performance and interface feel more aligned than in earlier generations. From a user perspective, this translates into a system that behaves more consistently across different hardware configurations, particularly on newer laptops and desktop machines that benefit from updated drivers and kernel optimizations. At the same time, Ubuntu continues to support a wide range of older hardware, although expectations around smooth performance have shifted compared to earlier Ubuntu releases, where lightweight operation was the primary focus. One of the most noticeable changes in Ubuntu 26.04 is the shift in baseline expectations for smooth performance. While the system can still run on modest hardware, a comfortable experience now generally requires more memory and stronger CPU performance than earlier generations of Linux desktops. This is largely due to the evolution of desktop environments and system services. Gnome has become more visually rich and functionally integrated. Wayland has become the default display system in most configurations, and background services now handle more tasks than before. The result is a desktop that feels modern and fluid on current hardware, but may feel heavier on older machines that previously handled Linux effortlessly. This mirrors a broader trend across operating systems, where modern features naturally come with increased resource usage. The key difference compared to Windows 11 is not raw requirement levels alone, but enforcement. Windows often blocks installation on unsupported hardware, while Ubuntu remains flexible enough to install in more scenarios. Even if performance is not optimal, Ubuntu 26.04 ships with Gnome 50, and this is one of the most important parts of the release, because it directly affects how users interact with the system every day. The desktop experience has become more refined, with improved animations, smoother multitasking behavior, and better support for multi-monitor setups. Fractional scaling has also been improved, which is important for high-resolution displays that are now common across laptops and monitors. Wayland continues to replace X11 as the default session in most setups, which improves rendering consistency and security isolation between applications. This change also reduces some long-standing graphical glitches that users experienced in earlier Linux desktop environments. there is also a noticeable shift in how system tools are integrated. Instead of relying on fragmented utilities, Gnome 50 pushes toward a more unified experience where settings, monitoring, and file management feel like part of the same ecosystem. On Windows 11, interface updates have been more layered over time rather than structural replacements. Ubuntu takes a more foundational approach here, rebuilding parts of the experience rather than continuously patching older layers. Security has become one of the strongest areas where Ubuntu 26.04 differentiates itself. Modern Linux distributions already benefit from permission-based architecture, but this release expands that foundation with additional protections. System-level encryption has been improved with better integration of hardware-backed security features. Secure boot compatibility is more robust, and the system chain of trust from firmware to operating system has been tightened. There is also increasing use of memory-safe programming languages in core utilities, reducing the risk of entire categories of vulnerabilities that are common in traditional system tools. Another important change is the gradual modernization of system components towards safer implementations. Tools that historically relied on older memory management techniques are being rewritten or replaced in ways that reduce crash risks and exploit surfaces. Windows 11 also offers strong security features, especially through TPM integration and virtualization-based isolation. However, those features are often tied to specific hardware requirements and system configurations that are not always visible or adjustable to the end user. Ubuntu's approach is more transparent, with security mechanisms that are easier to inspect and, in many cases, customized depending on user needs. Performance improvements in Ubuntu 26.04 are not just about raw speed, but about consistency under load. The updated kernel improves task scheduling, which helps systems remain responsive during multitasking, especially when running development environments, browsers with many tabs, or background services. Graphics performance has also improved through updated Mesa drivers and better integration with modern GPU stacks. NVIDIA and AMD support has become more stable over recent Linux kernel generations, reducing the gap between Linux and Windows in supported workloads. In gaming scenarios, Linux is still not universally ahead, but the gap is smaller than it was a few years ago. Vulkan-based games and Proton-supported titles continue to perform well in many cases, and compatibility layers have improved significantly. Windows still leads in overall game compatibility due to native support and industry prioritization, but Linux is increasingly viable for users who do not rely on specific anti-cheat systems or Windows-exclusive titles. One of the most frequently cited reasons users consider switching away from Windows 11 is control over system behavior and data handling. Windows has steadily expanded telemetry, cloud integration, and system-wide recommendations. While many of these features can be adjusted, they are often integrated deeply into the operating system experience. Ubuntu 26.04 takes a different direction. The system is open source, meaning its components can be inspected and modified. Telemetry is minimal and typically optional depending on configuration choices. There is no requirement for a cloud account to use the desktop environment, and core system functions remain accessible offline. The result is a system that behaves more predictably in terms of data flow and background activity. For users who prioritize transparency, this becomes a significant factor in decision-making. Despite its improvements, Ubuntu still faces the same structural limitation that Linux has always faced: proprietary software ecosystems. Professional tools in areas like advanced video editing, certain engineering software, and some commercial creative applications remain Windows first or Windows exclusive. While alternatives exist on Linux, they are not always one-to-one replacements in workflow or feature parity. However, for users whose daily work revolves around web applications, programming, server management, education, or general productivity, Ubuntu 26.04 covers most needs without major friction. The modern browser has become the center of many workflows, and that shift reduces the dependency on operating system-specific software in many cases. Ubuntu 26.04 represents more than a routine update cycle. It reflects how Linux has matured into a full desktop platform rather than a specialized alternative. Over the past few years, Linux has steadily closed gaps that once kept it confined to servers, developers, and niche users. With this release, that progression becomes more visible in everyday desktop use, where stability, usability, and hardware compatibility now feel aligned with mainstream expectations rather than experimental ones. The combination of modern kernel improvements, a redesigned desktop environment, stronger security foundations, and better hardware support places it in a very different position compared to older Linux releases. Performance tuning at the kernel level improves responsiveness under multitasking, while updated graphics stacks reduce long-standing friction with modern GPUs. The desktop experience itself feels more cohesive, with smoother interaction patterns and fewer inconsistencies between applications and system tools. At the same time, Windows 11 continues evolving toward a more managed, tightly integrated ecosystem with increasing reliance on cloud services, account-based features, and hardware enforcement policies. This creates a clearer separation in philosophy. One direction emphasizes user control and system transparency, while the other focuses on unified management, standardization, and deeper platform integration across devices and services. These two directions are increasingly distinct. One prioritizes openness, customization, and transparency. The other prioritizes integration, standardization, and controlled system behavior. The difference is no longer subtle. It directly shapes how users interact with their machines on a daily basis, from installation choices to background processes and update behavior. Neither approach is universally better across all scenarios. The relevance depends on what the system is being used for, what level of control is required, and how much convenience or structure the user prefers in their computing environment. Ubuntu 26.04 does not eliminate the need for Windows 11, and it is not trying to. What it does is expand the range of users who can realistically consider Linux as a primary desktop operating system without major compromises in usability. For users who rely heavily on proprietary Windows software, the transition still does not make sense in most cases. But for developers, students, cloud-focused professionals, and users who want a more controlled computing environment, Ubuntu 26.04 has reached a level where it can no longer be dismissed as a secondary option. The decision in 2026 is less about whether Linux can replace Windows in theory, and more about whether it already fits your workflow better than you might expect.